Good evening, everyone. I'm glad you're with us again. We're going to continue with our series of lessons on dumb ways to die. Tonight, we're going to look at Jezebel, who was dying for some dog food. Actually, she was dying to become some dog food, but that's a little beside the point. We'll talk about it as we come to it closer. In the meantime, we continue with looking at ways in which people died that were terrible and gory ways to die in the Bible because they wouldn't listen to God or do what God wanted them to do. I want us to start tonight by just talking about Jezebel and Ahab. They were married to one another. They were probably the most wicked couple, or one of the most wicked couples ever in the history of the world. And you start in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 29 through 30, if you want to go with me to the Bible. 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 29 through 30. And we'll look at this wicked couple as they began their life together. And now Ahab, the son of Omri, became king over Israel in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah. And Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. Now, at this point in time, of course, the kingdom of Israel is divided between the northern and the southern kingdoms. The northern kingdom being what is known as Israel, and the southern kingdom known as Judah. And so Omri, or Ahab, rather, the son of Omri, is the king over Israel, the northern kingdom. And he becomes that in the 38th year of King Asa, who is the king of Judah. And Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria. That's where the headquarters of Samaria was, or of Israel was in Samaria at that period of time. He reigned there for 22 years, a long time to be a king in that day and time. But he did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. And there are some really wicked people before him, but he did more than even the rest of them did. One of the reasons is because he introduces something really terrible to Israel, and that is the worship of Baal. If you look at 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 31 and 32, it came about that he married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and he went to serve Baal and worshipped him. So he erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which also he built in Samaria. Ahab also made the Asherah, and he goes on to describe what he did with the Asherah poles. What basically he did was he introduced Baal worship, and Jezebel's name actually includes the word Baal, the name for Baal in it, and we'll talk about that as we continue on. But he introduces Baal worship and also the worship of the consort of Baal, the wife of Baal, if you will. And that was Asherah, sometimes known as Ashtaroth. The name meanings of these people involved. Jezebel means "where is the prince," and her name basically means what happened what happened to Baal when he died, when Mot kills him every year, and then he comes back to reign again as he's reborn again. So it has to do with the annual death of Baal, which was something celebrated in the nation of Israel and other places that worship Baal. Ethbaal, her father, means toward Baal. So basically, they're a Baal worshiping family, and Ahab decides to add to the Israel's sins by worshiping Baal and Asherah. Asherah was worshipped usually by planting groves of trees and sometimes carving totem poles or what you might call a totem pole out of those. Sometimes just worshiping the groves of trees themselves. Sometimes worshiping the skies above the groves of trees. Then Baal, of course, was worshipped as a bull sometimes, and sometimes as a god that brought the harvest and so on. So he adds to Israel the sins of worshiping Baal and Asherah. What's so sad about Baal worship is that it was pagan nature worship. It was the worship of nature from a pagan standpoint. Baal became the storm or the rain god of the Sidonians and others of the Philistine race. He was an affront against God, the Creator, because he was a false god. He involved the worship of Baal involved harlotry and temple prostitution. They would have males and females having sex in the temples to worship the fertility god, who was Baal, the storm and the rain god who brought fertility to the land. Sexual fertility cults to revive Baal when he died at the hands of Mot each summer were a commonplace of the worship of Baal as well. So it was very much a sexual religion, something that had to do with the fertility of the land. Occasionally there were human sacrifices, though that was not as much popular with Baal worship as it was with Moloch and Chemosh. But certainly there was some of the human sacrifice associated with the Baal worship. Jezebel was one of the most wicked women ever to live. And in 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 4, we find out that she killed all the Lord's prophets at the time, as many as she could get her hands on. When she became the king's wife and she began to worship Baal as she did, she decided to put to death all of the prophets of the Lord who were protesting, I'm sure, the worship of Baal. So in chapter 18 of verse 4 of 1 Kings, it says, "For when Jezebel destroyed the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by fifties in a cave." Obadiah was a man who was faithful to the Lord, and he took 100 prophets, divided them into two groups, and hid them in caves to try to protect them from Jezebel. One of the things that we become really impressed with Jezebel is how far she would go to get whatever she wanted, whatever it was. in 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 7, further along in the story that we are beginning, there was a man who was named Naboth, and he had a vineyard that Ahab, the king, wanted to plant a vegetable garden in. That was a beautiful, productive vineyard, growing grapes and so on. But Naboth didn't want to sell. Ahab wanted him to sell, and Naboth didn't want to sell. So Ahab did what he does. He just went and pouted about it a while. And Jezebel saw him pouting, wanted to know what he was crying about and what he was pouting about. And so when he told her what the problem was, she said, you're the king. Why can't you take the vineyard if you want it? So she conspired against Naboth and said, we're going to frame him. And they framed him for blasphemy and had him stoned to death by the people of the land. So they framed him, and he was put to death because he was framed as being a blasphemer, which was a killing offense in that period of time. And Ahab therefore got his vineyard. So that's the degrees to which they would go to do what they wanted to do. They were very wicked people. Would even bring about the death of innocent folks just to get what they wanted. During all this time, we were introduced to another character who's very important in the Bible, and that's Elijah, the prophet of God. Elijah becomes very central to the story of Jezebel and Ahab because he proclaims a drought on all of Israel because of the terrible things that they were doing. And that drought continued on for 3 years. He proclaims a drought on Israel for 3 years. And in 1 Kings chapter 17 and verse 1, Elijah the Tishbite, who was one of the settlers of Gilead, said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, surely there shall be neither dew nor rain for these years except by my word. So basically, Elijah is the prophet who's going to say when it rains next. He doesn't let it rain for 3 long years. And during that period of time, everything pretty much dies off and everything becomes a drought-stricken land. So he is very much troublesome to Ahab and Jezebel, but they still persist in their wickedness. Eventually, Elijah and Ahab meet up at a period of time when Ahab was very upset with him. 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 17. When Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, Is this you troubler of Israel? Now, Ahab calls Elijah the trouble of Israel, even though Elijah is only doing what God tells him to do. He said, I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and you have followed the Baals. So as Ahab and his wife and the rest of Israel have decided to follow the Baals, Elijah says, this is your fault. The drought is your fault. I'm causing it, but it's your fault. And if you'll just stop worshiping the Baals, he'd bring rain on the land again. As a result of all of this turmoil that goes on, we have one of the big showdowns in Scripture between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. As the division progresses between him and Ahab and Jezebel, eventually Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal, some 600 in numbers, I recall the number in Scripture, but something like 600 prophets of Baal, challenges them to a duel, if you will, a godly duel on the top of Mount Carmel. In 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 25 and following, you can read the story if you want to spend the time reading all the story, and I hope you will. It's a beautiful account of God coming in on the side of what's right. But basically, the rules of the challenge was, or the rules were, that each side was to get an ox, and they were to offer that ox on an altar. And the question was, which God will answer by fire? Now, I put the capital G on God there because you know, and I know who God really is, and who actually answers by fire by the end of the story. But the question that Elijah was asking of the prophets of Baal is, how long will you hesitate between two opinions? Now, as the prophets go about their business, Elijah is very fair. He gives the prophets of Baal the first chance to call their God. So they sacrifice their ox and they put them on the altar, and they begin to prance and dance and shout and cry. And as the day progresses, they get more and more frustrated and more flustered and more crazy in their behavior, till eventually they're cutting themselves with stones and trying to bleed in behalf of their God, asking Baal to send fire down from heaven to burn up the sacrifice. Of course, he doesn't do it, and so eventually they have to admit defeat. They have to stand down. So Elijah comes forward, and he takes his ox and puts it on the altar, and then he has them dig a trench all around the altar and has the trench filled up with water. Now, remember, there's been a drought on the land for a long time, and he has this huge trench filled with huge amounts of water, which was a very, very immense waste of resources at the time. But he knows what's going to happen. And so anyway, he has the trench filled with water. Then he has water poured all over the altar and all over the oxen, and makes it all soaking wet. Then he prays for God to bring fire down from heaven. During the time of the Baal worshipers were trying to get their God to send down fire, Elijah was taunting them, like saying something like, maybe you need to shout louder. He can't hear you. Maybe you went on vacation, something like that. Instead, he now prays to God one time, says, send fire down from heaven. And God, of course, sends, and Yahweh answers from heaven, sends down fire. Elijah then takes the 600 prophets of Baal and puts them to death there at the after the showdown on Carmel. So now, of course, Elijah is enemy number one to Ahab and Jezebel, especially to Jezebel, because she's proud of her Baal worship and her Baal prophets. As a result of that, in 1 Kings chapter 19, Jezebel decides she's going to put Elijah to death, and she challenges Elijah and says, next time I see you, I'm going to put you to death. He decides to flee for his life. Now, he's just had a tremendous victory from God. He's just called down fire from heaven at God's behest, and God sent the fire when he called for it. He's just put to death all these prophets of Baal, but now Jezebel says, I'm going to kill you. If you're around and I find you, I'm going to kill you. So he flees. He should have just stood firm. I'm sure God would have protected him, and God knows he would have protected him, but instead he flees for his life. Well, God finds him in the wilderness and sends him some food and takes care of him for a few days. And then he sends him by way of a long fast. He sends him to Mount Horeb, which is known as Sinai. This is the mountain where God delivered the law to Moses many centuries before that, or several centuries before that, and where the God has always come down to the earth to meet people on the earth prior to the building of the temple. So Mount Horeb is where he sends him, and he goes to Mount Horeb and he speaks to God there. You'll remember the story if you're very familiar with it. You'll remember that Elijah is hiding in a cave there on the mountain, or he's standing in the cave, and God passes by, and there's this big storm tears up the side of the mountain, and there's lightning, and there's an earthquake, and there's fire burning the mountain, and then there's this huge wind, and God was not in any of those as the story progresses. And then it says God begins to speak to him in a gentle breeze, and the question that God asked him is, "Why are you here, Elijah?" Elijah tells him this long story about how Jezebel wants his life and whatever. God just patiently says again, "Why are you here?" His question was, why are you not where I sent you? Why are you not doing what I told you to do? Why are you not standing firm for me in front of Jezebel? So as a result, God finds that he's not capable of being the prophet that he wants him to be. So God removes him from being a prophet, even though he's a tremendous and a great prophet, one of the best prophets ever. God removes him from being a prophet, and he has him go and pick his own replacement. He picks Elisha for his replacement and tells Elijah to go and replace himself with Elisha. And he also tells him to anoint Jehu as king of Israel because he's going to take over Israel again and also Judah for God. So through Jehu, then, we're going to jump forward to the story. The story is very long in Scripture, but you come to 2 Kings chapter 9, verses 7 through 10. And we have Ahab then in big trouble, and Jehu is strong now. And God begins to make prophecies through Jehu. And in 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 7 through 10, he says to Jehu, "You shall strike the house of Ahab your master, that I may avenge the blood of my servants, the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of the Lord at the hands of Jezebel." So all those that Jezebel put to death, God is going to revenge himself against Ahab and against Jezebel for that loss. He's going to do it through this man named Jehu. Now, I'll show you Jehu there driving a chariot because at one point when he's defeating one of the enemies of God, the person will say, "I see Jehu driving driving his chariot like a crazy man, or like a wild man." So he was just that progressive, that aggressive rather, and trying to do the will of the Lord. He was striking out against Ahab and against all of his enemies. So God makes another prophecy through Jehu, and he says, "The whole house of Ahab shall perish, and I will cut off from Ahab every male person, both bond and free, in Israel." So no longer will there be a king after the lineage of Ahab in Israel, because God is going to replace him with Jehu, who is not of the same lineage. He's going to change the lineage of the kings in Israel by having Ahab defeated by Jehu, and he's going to cut off every male from his family. That's happened a few times in the history of the world, and a few times in the Bible that happened, or almost happened. Like, for example, when Saul's family was almost all put to death, except for one guy named Mephibosheth, who was saved from that destruction. Then there's a prophecy against Jezebel, and that's where we get the title of our lesson tonight. God prophesies through Jehu that he'll put to death Jezebel. So the dog shall eat Jezebel in the territory of Jezreel, and none shall bury her. Now, when you hear the word dogs there, don't think about Fifi and Fido. Think more about either hyenas or jackals, those kinds of wild dogs, like the wild dingo dogs, something like that. These wild, ravenous, bloodthirsty dogs. And that's what God is going to have to eat up Jezebel in the territory of Jezreel, he says. Now, we're going to see that this, of course, comes true exactly like God says it does. So now the stage is set for the death of these people, and we talked about these dumb ways to die. It's not just the death of Jezebel we're talking about tonight. We're also going to talk about the death of Ahab, the king. In 1 Kings chapter 22, verse 34 through 38, we have the story of the death of Ahab. Now, Ahab and Jehoshaphat, from both Israel and then from Judah, have banded together to war against Ramoth Gilead. So as they're battling for the right to own the land that they were challenging over, a random arrow strikes Ahab, and he's trying to get out of the battle. A random arrow flies and hits him, and he dies later that evening. The random arrow, of course, sent from Jehu. So they wash his blood out of the chariot at a pool where the harlots bathed, and that's the end of Ahab. He basically dies, and he is no more. And the dogs lick up his blood. He sort of becomes dog food after a fashion as well, though not to the same degree as Jezebel will. And then Jehu is also called to kill Jehoram. Jehoram is another person in the lineage of the kings. And so 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 22 through 24, when Joram, he's also known as Joram, sometimes as Jehoram, but as Joram saw Jehu, he said, "Is it peace, Jehu?" And he actually starts sending out these, he sees Jehu from a long way off and sends out messengers to go and talk to Jehu and find out if he's coming in peace or if he's coming for war. And so as each one of these messengers go out, Jehu will say, "What peace do I have to do with you?" So they'll join. He says, "Turn in behind me." So they'll join him instead of going back. And he sends all these people out. They never come back. And eventually Jehu comes between close enough to speak to Jehoram himself. And he said, "What peace, so long as the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so many?" So, of course, Joram is the son of Jezebel and would have been in line for the throne, except that he's going to lose his life right here. What peace, so long as the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so many? Now, the harlotries, of course, has to do with the worship of Baal, and the same thing with the witchcrafts. These are all things that she did in relationship to the worship of Baal and Asherah. So Joram reigned about and fled and said to Ahaziah, "There is treachery, O Ahaziah." So they began to run for their lives, and Jehu drew his bow with his full strength and shot Joram between his arms, and the arrow went through his heart, and he sank in his chariot. So now he's put to death the main heir to the throne of Ahab after Ahab dies. Now he just has left Ahaziah, who's the king of Judah at the time. 2 Kings chapter 22, verse 27. When Ahaziah, the king of Judah, saw this, he fled by the way of the garden house. So Jehu pursued him and said, "Shoot him too in the chariot." So they shot him at the ascent of Gur, which is at Ablim, but he fled to Megiddo and died there. Now, Megiddo was a place that was really a stronghold. If he'd made it safely to Megiddo, he probably would have been out of reach for a long time. It was an almost impregnable place for people to go to flee from trouble. And so he flees there, but he's already been shot. He dies there at Megiddo, and so that's the end of the king of Judah. So now both Judah and Israel are without a king, and Jehu will fill that position in just a very short time. Now we come to Jezebel and her death in 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 32 and following. If you want to read the story, the long story, it's very worthwhile for you to read. But right now we're going to go to the short account of this. We're going to go to the short account of the story. She's up in the window, and she has some conversation with Jehu, and he says to the servants up there, "If anyone's on my side, throw her out the window." So the servants grab Jezebel and throw her out the window, and she falls down to the ground below, and she's trampled by the horses. And then they go in to have dinner and have a little party because Jezebel's now dead, sort of like Ding Dong, the witch is dead sort of thing. And so they go and have a little party. When they come back out to find her, to bury her, they find nothing more than her skull and the feet and the palms of her hands. Which you'll recall the story that we told earlier about the worshiping of the false god of the Philistines earlier, when they put God in the house of Dagon. Or they put the Ark of the Covenant in the house of Dagon, the god of the Philistines. How the god fell on the doorstep and his head broke off. Then his hands and his feet were there. The palms of his hands and the soles of his feet were all that was left. Which is basically God saying that from the top of the head to the bottoms of the feet, He owns you, and He owned Jezebel. They went to bury her, and they found nothing more than her skull and the feet and the palms of her hands. She was eaten by the dogs during the time that they were having their little party, and when they went back, they found nothing. And so it was said of Jezebel in the scripture there that she was eaten by dogs, and she became as dung on the face of the field. So wherever the dogs left their mark later on, that's where Jezebel was buried. Basically, she just became dung of the dogs. That's a terrible way to die, folks, a dumb way to die, because if you do what God doesn't want you to do, if you spend your life against God, eventually you're going to have a horrible death, or at least an eternal horrible death at the hands of God. God will not be made fun of, and God will not be ignored, and he will not be supplanted by any other false god. We have a message from this for today, for our own day and time. And I've got two verses that I want to share with you tonight. First of all, from 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 14. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 14, where we, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. Now, this is Paul talking to the church of Corinth, and he's telling them, I want you to flee from idolatry. Well, what kind of idolatry were they doing in Corinth? Well, basically, they were worshiping themselves, and they're worshiping their own power, worshiping their own prowess, and so on. Modern idolatry doesn't look so much like ancient idolatry in so many cases. Sometimes it just has to do with anything that causes us to turn away from Almighty God and substitute something else for God. So it can be money, or it can be possessions, or it can even be family. It can be any number of things that cause us to be idolatrous people. In fact, when Paul writes again to the church of Colossae, chapter 3 and verse 5, he discusses some of the things that become idolatry for us. He says, therefore, consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality. That would be sexual immorality, impurity, and the same thing, sexual impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to idolatry. All those first things there that he mentions are all idolatry. Sexual immorality, such as sexual affairs and homosexuality, and all of those things that are associated with sexual immorality, premarital sex, all of those things become a form of idolatry, where we're worshiping sex, and we're worshiping lust rather than worshiping God. And then impurity and passion and evil desire, all those things have to do with the same idea. But the one that probably strikes me the most is the word greed. Anytime we have anything that we want more than we want God, anytime we're greedy for anything that we don't really need, anything that's bad for us, anything that's negative against us for God's sake, any of those things that we have becomes idolatry, because we're worshiping a thing rather than we're worshiping God. You can't serve God in mammon, you can't serve God in money. We have to serve only God and God alone. And we can only have one master in our life. So our message for today is, don't let idolatry cause you to become food for the dogs or anything else. Don't die a dumb death because you choose something over God. Put God first in everything that you do, and you'll have a blessed life in this life and also in the world to come. That's what our main goal is. Our main ambition is to be saved for eternity from God. So our invitation for you tonight is this: if you are not a member of God's family, if you have been living in the world and you're still in need of being baptized, ready to baptize you tonight, if you'll come and give yourself over to the Lord. Or if there's anything else that we can do for you, if we can pray for you, if we can make anything happen for you, if we can do anything for you, let us know those things as well, either through the chat or by way of calling us, or whatever you have means. There's lots of different means to contact us. Go to our webpage at www.cleanchurch.org, and you can find contact information there as well. So whatever your needs are, let us know at this time as we go to our song leader and have an invitation song. Give me just a second to change over these slides.